You can't sit here. You can't sit here. Get up. This isn't your place. You don't belong here, not in this seat, not on this plane. Get out before I call security. Move to the back where you belong, or you won't be flying today. People like you don't sit with us. Someone get her removed, now. Stand up, or I'll make sure you're thrown off this flight before we even take off. The shout cracked through Heathrow's busy terminal like a gunshot. Passengers waiting at gate 14 froze, heads snapping toward the source. A red-faced white man in an expensive coat stood in the center of the lounge, pointing an accusing finger at a young black woman seated quietly by the window. She doesn't belong in first class. His voice was sharp, almost gleeful, as though he wanted the entire gate to hear. Someone get security and move her now. The woman, Amara Hale, mid-20s, poised in a tailored navy blazer and black trousers, didn't move. She didn't even blink. Her boarding pass rested neatly in her hand as she lifted her eyes to meet his glare. Calm. Silent. Whispers rippled instantly. What's going on? Murmured a man near the front of the queue. Maybe she's trying to sneak in. Others nodded, their murmurs like sparks feeding the fire. The gate agent, a young attendant behind the podium, froze in place. His eyes darted between the enraged passenger and Amara, his lips parting as if to say something, but he stayed silent. The tension in the air was thick, every passing second stretching longer than the last. Amara's expression didn't change. She slowly straightened in her chair, her posture radiating an unsettling calm. Her fingers tapped her phone once, a message sent without a word. The man took a step closer, his voice dropping low but cutting. People like you, don't sit up front. I'll make sure you're thrown off this flight before we even board. Gasps broke the uneasy silence. All eyes stayed locked on Amara. And still, she didn't flinch. Boarding turns hostile. The boarding call echoed over the loudspeakers, but the tension at gate 14 didn't fade. If anything, it grew sharper as passengers began lining up, stealing glances at Amara like she was already guilty of something. The red-faced man, Richard Sloan, a self-important banker in his late 50s, wasn't done. As the line began to move toward the jet bridge, he deliberately slowed near Amara, his voice low but meant to carry. Don't think you're stepping on that plane ahead of me, he hissed, his eyes narrowing. People like you get bumped. I'll make sure of it. The words hung heavy, just loud enough for others to hear. A well-dressed couple nearby exchanged awkward looks but said nothing, their eyes sliding away as if afraid to get involved. Amara didn't respond. Her gaze remained forward, her face a mask of calm resolve. She rose smoothly from her chair when her group was called, adjusting her blazer with measured precision, and walked toward the boarding gate without a single word. Richard wasn't satisfied. He accidentally brushed against her shoulder, hard enough to make a few heads turn. Watch where you're going, he muttered, loud enough for everyone in line to hear. A faint, smug grin tugged at his lips when no one spoke up. The gate attendant glanced between them nervously but kept scanning boarding passes. The crowd seemed frozen, torn between discomfort and curiosity. Amara, still silent, slipped her phone from her pocket and tapped a message with a single thumb. One short vibration confirmed it was sent. She slid it back into her blazer, her expression unreadable. Richard's smirk deepened as he muttered to himself, she won't make it past the runway. And as they stepped onto the jet bridge, a hush fell over the boarding line, everyone sensing something bigger was about to unfold. Inside the cabin, the silent target. The moment Amara stepped into the first-class cabin, every detail screamed luxury, wide leather seats, golden accents along the windows, and a soft hum of ambient music drifting through the air. Passengers sipped champagne and scrolled through their tablets, but all eyes seemed to slide toward her as if she had walked into forbidden territory. She placed her small carry-on under the seat, her movements graceful, unhurried. Her calm composure only seemed to make the stares sharper. A socialite draped in a pearl-white dress leaned toward her companion, whispering loudly enough for others to hear, "How does someone like that afford a seat here?" Her companion chuckled softly, shaking his head as if the answer was obvious. Richard Sloan, now 2 rows behind, grinned smugly. He muttered to another passenger, "Told you she was out of place. Watch, she won't last the flight." The whispers, soft but deliberate, rippled through the cabin like a low current, each one stoking the tension. The lead flight attendant, Carla Mason, mid-40s, razor-sharp uniform and an even sharper attitude, spotted Amara almost instantly. Her polite smile, plastered on for the other passengers, faltered as soon as her gaze locked on her. She approached with measured steps, voice low but edged with cold authority. "May I see your boarding pass again?" she asked, her tone sweet for the nearby passengers but laced with doubt. Amara met her gaze steadily. "You already scanned it at the gate," she replied, her voice calm, even. Carla's smile thinned. "I just want to make sure there hasn't been a mix-up. This section is reserved for our elite travelers." A few heads turned at that. The businessman seated across the aisle frowned, shifting slightly as he watched the exchange. Amara didn't flinch. She slid her boarding pass from her blazer pocket, held it out without a word, and locked eyes with Carla. The air in the cabin grew heavy. Even the soft background music felt like it had stopped. The public challenge. Carla held the boarding pass between her manicured fingers, her eyes darting across it with exaggerated slowness. Each second dragged, the quiet hum of the cabin amplifying the tension. Passengers pretended not to stare, but their eyes lingered, their whispers low and sharp. Richard Sloane leaned forward in his seat, a smirk tugging at his lips. "See," he said under his breath, just loud enough for the man next to him to hear. "She doesn't belong here. Probably used some cheap trick to get this seat. They'll throw her back where she belongs." The socialite in pearls leaned sideways, her voice dripping with disdain. "Honestly, the nerve of some people. Acting like they're entitled to the front of the plane." Her companion nodded, sipping champagne, as though Amara couldn't hear every word. Carla finally looked up, her smile polite but cold. "This pass checks out," she said, her tone flat, "but if you're not able to follow the rules and respect the other passengers, we may have to reassign your seat for everyone's comfort." Gasps and murmurs floated through the cabin. It wasn't a direct accusation, but everyone understood what Carla was implying. Amara sat motionless, her hands folded neatly on her lap, her expression calm, almost unnervingly calm. "Are you suggesting I've done something wrong?" Amara asked softly, her tone even, though her eyes never left Carla's. Carla tilted her head, her smile widening just slightly. "Not yet. But disruptive behavior isn't tolerated. Let's avoid any issues before takeoff." The businessman across the aisle frowned openly now, his jaw tightening. "She hasn't done anything disruptive," he said, his voice low but firm. "Maybe you should worry about actual problems instead of harassing paying customers." Carla's head snapped toward him, her polite veneer cracking for just a moment. "Sir, I'd ask you not to interfere." Amara's gaze shifted briefly to the businessman, a silent acknowledgement, before returning to Carla. "Maybe you should check your manifest before making assumptions," she said quietly, her words deliberate, almost like a warning. Carla's jaw tightened. She handed back the boarding pass with a stiff motion, her smile returning, though it no longer reached her eyes. "Enjoy your flight, Ms. Hale," she said, her voice strained. "For now." Richard chuckled under his breath. The socialite smirked. The rest of the cabin pretended to look away, but their curiosity burned hotter than ever. And through it all, Amara sat still, her phone resting lightly in her hand, the faintest vibration pulsing beneath her fingers as another message came through. The threat before takeoff. The final boarding call echoed faintly in the background as the last passengers filed in, but the tension in first class had already reached a breaking point. Carla lingered near the galley, her arms crossed, speaking in a low, clipped whisper to Richard Sloane, who leaned back smugly in his seat. "She's nothing but trouble," Richard muttered, his eyes flicking toward Amara. "Make sure she's dealt with before we're in the air. People like her don't deserve this treatment. If she causes a scene, get her off." Carla's lips curved into a thin, knowing smile. "Trust me. I have ways of handling passengers who don't know their place. We'll make this quick." They didn't realize a younger flight attendant, Grace, was just around the corner, quietly overhearing every word. Grace's brow furrowed, her fingers tightening around the manifest she was holding. Her eyes drifted toward Amara, who sat calmly by the window, completely unaware of the whispered plotting. Richard adjusted his cufflinks, his voice dripping with contempt. By the time we land, she'll wish she never stepped on this plane. I'll see to it personally if you won't. Carla glanced toward the seated passengers, her expression slipping back into its professional mask as she stepped out from the galley. Let me take care of this. Once we're cruising, I'll make sure she's reassigned to where she belongs, or offloaded at the first opportunity. Across the aisle, the businessman who had spoken up earlier noticed their furtive glances and the tone of their hushed conversation. His eyes narrowed as he leaned slightly forward, his instincts telling him something was off. Meanwhile, Amara sat completely composed, her phone resting on her thigh. A faint buzz sounded again. She unlocked the screen, glanced at a short message, and her lips curved into the faintest trace of a smile before she set it face down on the armrest. The engines began to rumble beneath the cabin, a soft vibration filling the air as the plane prepared for departure. Carla strode past Amara's seat, her polished heels clicking sharply against the floor. She paused just long enough to murmur under her breath, "Enjoy your seat while it lasts." Amara's gaze lifted slowly, her expression calm but unyielding. "You're making a mistake," she said softly, her voice even but firm, the kind of tone that made Carla's steps falter ever so slightly. And for the first time, a flicker of unease crossed Carla's perfectly composed face. The engines roared louder as the plane taxied toward the runway. Inside the first-class cabin, a brittle silence stretched between the passengers, broken only by the occasional clink of a champagne glass or the hum of safety announcements over the speakers. Amara sat still, her seatbelt fastened, her gaze fixed calmly on the seat back ahead. She hadn't said a word since Carla's warning, but her composed demeanor seemed to make the others more restless. Richard Sloane, 2 rows back, leaned toward the man beside him, muttering just loud enough for Amara, and anyone else nearby, to hear. "Mark my words, she won't last this flight. People like that always get found out." His words oozed with arrogance, each syllable designed to provoke. The pearl-draped socialite in the front row gave a smug little chuckle, leaning back in her seat as if she were watching a private show. Honestly, she whispered to her companion, it's embarrassing for the airline to let anyone just walk into first class these days. Grace, the junior attendant, moved quietly down the aisle, checking belts and stowing loose items. She cast a quick glance toward Amara, her brow furrowing at the quiet hostility simmering all around her. Her fingers brushed the manifest tucked into her pocket, as if she were debating whether to double-check the passenger list again. Carla appeared from the galley, her expression a flawless mask of professionalism. But her sharp eyes cut toward Amara like blades. She stopped at the aisle, her voice calm but with an undercurrent of warning. "Ms. Hale, if there are any disturbances during this flight, we won't hesitate to escort you off at our next stop. I expect complete cooperation." Amara turned her head slowly, meeting Carla's gaze. Her voice, soft but steady, carried through the tense cabin. "I haven't caused a disturbance. But if you keep pushing this, you'll regret it." The words were calm, but they landed with a weight that made even the pearl-draped socialite glance nervously toward Carla. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the final approach for takeoff. The cabin dimmed slightly, the lights along the floor illuminating. Carla forced a thin smile and stepped back toward the galley, muttering under her breath, "We'll see about that." As the plane lifted off, Grace stole another look at Amara, noticing her phone vibrate once more. A short glance at the screen, a subtle nod to herself, and Amara set it down again, silent as ever. The businessman across the aisle leaned back, arms folded, his eyes flicking from Carla to Richard to Amara. Something told him this flight was about to get very interesting. The first in-flight confrontation. The plane had settled into a smooth climb, the hum of the engine steady as first-class passengers loosened their seatbelts and began to relax. Drinks were poured, soft music floated through the cabin, and yet the air felt heavy, as if every person knew a storm was coming. Carla emerged from the galley, a tray of champagne in hand. Her polite smile returned for the pearl-draped socialite and the other regulars, her voice warm as she offered them refills. But when she reached Amara's row, that warmth vanished. Would you like something to drink? Carla asked, her tone flat, as if the words were a chore she couldn't avoid. Amara glanced up briefly, her voice calm and even. Water would be fine. Carla's lips twitched. We'll see if there's any left, she said, moving past without another glance. A few heads turned at the remark, but no one spoke. Richard Sloane, seated just a row back, chuckled under his breath. You might as well start walking to coach now, he muttered, his voice dripping with satisfaction. Save yourself the embarrassment. The businessman across the aisle shifted in his seat, his brow furrowing. Is there a problem, sir? He asked coolly, his tone sharp enough to make Richard glance away. Carla returned a moment later, a single glass of water on her tray. But instead of handing it over politely, she leaned just slightly and let the glass tip, spilling a splash across Amara's lap and the carpet below. Oh! Carla gasped theatrically, though her eyes carried no remorse. You'll want to be careful where you put your legs. Wouldn't want to make a mess. A few passengers gasped softly. The pearl-draped socialite hid a smirk behind her hand. Grace, standing near the galley, froze, her eyes wide with disbelief. Amara calmly set the glass on the tray, her voice steady but cutting. I didn't move my legs. You walked into me. Carla's polite smile hardened. Watch your tone, Ms. Hale. We can always make seating adjustments if you're uncomfortable here. Amara tilted her head, her expression still calm, but her eyes sharp as glass. Adjustments can be made, she said softly, but not the way you think. Carla's steps faltered for just a moment. She turned sharply, heels clicking against the carpet, but for the first time, there was a flicker of doubt in her face. And Amara? She simply brushed the water from her lap, glanced once at her phone, and waited. The first major showdown. The hum of the engines was steady, but the atmosphere in first class was anything but calm. Carla emerged from the galley, her heels clicking sharply against the carpet as she strode directly toward Amara's row. Her professional smile was gone now, replaced with a tight, commanding expression. She stopped beside Amara's seat, her arms crossing as she addressed her loud enough for everyone in the cabin to hear. Miss Hale, I'm not going to repeat myself again. This section is for our elite passengers. If you don't move to a standard seat in coach, we will have security waiting at our next stop to escort you off the plane. A wave of murmurs rippled through the cabin. The pearl-draped socialite tilted her head toward her companion, whispering, finally. She doesn't belong up here. Richard Sloane smirked openly, leaning forward to watch, his eyes bright with satisfaction. Amara didn't flinch. Slowly, she closed the book resting on her lap and set it aside. Her gaze lifted to Carla, calm and unwavering. Her voice was soft, but it carried like a low echo through the tense cabin. I paid for this seat. I haven't broken any rules. And if you continue, you'll regret this more than you realize. Carla's jaw tightened, her expression hardening. Are you threatening me, Ms. Hale? Because threats don't end well on flights like this. Across the aisle, the businessman leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. She hasn't done a single thing wrong. Maybe you should stop harassing paying customers before you're the one in trouble. Carla turned sharply toward him, her eyes narrowing. Sir, this doesn't concern you. Please remain seated. Grace, still lingering near the galley, glanced down at the manifest hidden in her pocket, her knuckles whitening as she held it tighter. She looked toward Amara, her hesitation written across her face. Amara finally moved. She reached for her phone, typing something with deliberate slowness. One buzz, one short confirmation, and she set it down again on the armrest. Then, in that same calm tone, she said, "Make your call." "I'll wait." The silence that followed was deafening. Even Carla felt it, a faint chill creeping in as she realized, for the first time, that maybe she wasn't in control. Carla stood rigid beside Amara's seat, her perfectly composed face cracking just enough to reveal the tension underneath. The murmurs around the cabin grew louder, a few passengers whispering, others raising their phones subtly, recording the confrontation. Richard Sloane leaned back in his seat, his grin widening. This is what happens when people think they can buy their way into places they don't belong, he muttered to the passenger beside him, just loud enough to fuel the whispers. Carla's jaw tightened as she turned her head sharply. "Grace," she called out, her tone clipped, "bring me the intercom phone. We're getting the captain involved." Grace froze mid-step, her eyes flicking toward Amara, then back to Carla. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the manifest against her chest, her voice hesitant. "Shouldn't we double-check the list before?" "Now, Grace," Carla snapped, her tone sharp enough to make a couple of nearby passengers flinch. "I said bring me the phone. She's leaving this section one way or another." Amara, still seated, shifted her gaze slowly toward Carla. Her tone was steady, quiet, and deliberate. "Are you sure you want to do that? You've already crossed one line. Do you really want to cross another?" The businessman across the aisle leaned forward, his tone calm but cutting. "She's not the one causing a disturbance here, and we all see it. Maybe the captain should be called, but not for the reasons you think." Carla's eyes narrowed at him. "Sir, I suggest you keep your opinions to yourself unless you want to be reported as well." Grace stood frozen, the intercom phone in her hand, her thumb hovering over the call button. Her breathing quickened as she looked at Amara, who simply met her eyes with a calm, almost knowing expression. The cabin had gone so quiet now that even the faint hum of the engines felt louder. Passengers glanced at each other nervously, some reaching for their phones, others whispering things like, "Who is she? Why is she so calm?" Amara finally reached for her phone again, tapping it once. One short buzz, a confirmation. She set it down without looking at Carla and folded her hands neatly in her lap. Then she spoke softly, her voice carrying despite the quiet. "Call whoever you want. It won't end the way you think." Carla hesitated for a fraction of a second, long enough for Grace to notice the first flicker of doubt in her eyes. The cabin had gone from uneasy to suffocating. Every passenger could feel the tension as Grace, still holding the intercom phone, hesitated near Carla. The soft hum of the engines was the only sound until a faint click from the cockpit door broke the silence. The pilot, Captain Reeves, a tall, composed man in his late 40s, stepped out, his face calm but serious. His eyes swept over the cabin, noting the phones held discreetly in passenger hands, the way conversations had stilled, and Carla standing rigid beside Amara. "What's going on here?" His voice wasn't raised, but it carried authority that made a few passengers straighten in their seats. Carla turned immediately, her expression shifting into something practiced. "Captain, we have a disruptive passenger in first class. She refuses to comply with crew instructions and is disturbing our VIPs. I was about to request an offload at our next stop." Reeves' gaze shifted to Amara. She hadn't moved. Her phone rested on the armrest, her hands folded, her posture perfectly calm. She looked at him, not pleading, not defensive, just steady. "Is that true?" Reeves asked evenly. Amara's voice was soft, even, deliberate. "I've followed every instruction. I've done nothing disruptive, except exist in a seat I paid for. Perhaps your crew should explain why that's a problem." Murmurs rippled through the cabin. The businessman across the aisle leaned forward, his voice sharp but calm. "She's telling the truth. The only disturbance here is your flight attendant trying to push her out." Carla's head snapped toward him, her jaw tightening. "Sir, I'll remind you." Reeves held up a hand, silencing her instantly. His eyes narrowed just slightly as he turned back to Carla, his voice low enough for only the nearby rows to hear. "Are you absolutely sure about this? Because if I have to make a report, and it turns out this passenger has done nothing wrong, it won't be her career on the line." For the first time, Carla's confident posture faltered. Her lips parted as if to argue, but the weight in Reeves' tone made her hesitate. Grace, standing quietly to the side, tightened her grip on the manifest. She took a small step forward, her voice almost a whisper. "Captain, maybe I should show you something before this goes further." Reeves looked at her sharply, then nodded once. "Show me." Carla's eyes darted between them, a flash of unease flickering in her expression. Meanwhile, Amara leaned back slightly in her seat, her gaze calm as she tapped her phone once more. One buzz. Confirmation. Her lips curved into the faintest trace of a smile. And the captain, glancing from Amara to Carla, suddenly realized there was more to this situation than anyone had been told. The manifest reveals a clue. Grace's hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the manifest from her tablet, stepping closer to Captain Reeves. She glanced toward Carla, who was glaring daggers at her, but Grace ignored it. Her voice was low, but firm enough for the captain to hear. "Captain, her name is on the list. Priority 1. She's not just any passenger." Grace's eyes flicked toward Amara, who sat perfectly still, her calm gaze focused forward. "And there's a note attached to her file I think you should read." Reeves took the manifest, scanning the highlighted section. His brows furrowed, the faintest glimmer of recognition crossing his face. He looked up at Grace, then at Amara. For the first time, his posture shifted, straighter, more alert. Carla noticed, her confidence faltering. "What?" she demanded, stepping closer. "She's some business class upgrade, that's all. Probably pulled strings." Reeves cut her off sharply, his voice low but commanding. "Carla, stop talking." The firmness in his tone made a few passengers glance up, startled by the shift in authority. Richard Sloane, growing impatient in his seat, leaned forward and barked, "Are we just going to let her sit there and ruin the experience for everyone? Get her out, for God's sake!" His voice carried through the cabin, drawing groans and murmurs from other passengers. The businessman across the aisle finally stood, his voice cold. "The only people ruining the experience are the ones harassing a paying passenger. Maybe you should be the one moved." A few murmurs of agreement rippled around the cabin. Richard's face turned red, his smugness slipping as his eyes darted nervously toward the captain. Amara didn't move, didn't even blink. Her phone buzzed once more, a soft vibration against the armrest. She picked it up, typed a single word, and set it back down. Then, in a calm tone that cut through the murmurs, she finally spoke. "Your problems are just beginning." The entire cabin fell silent. Even Carla's breath seemed to catch for a moment as the hum of the engines filled the air, louder than before. Captain Reeves folded the manifest, his expression unreadable, but his eyes lingered on Amara, and for the first time, there was a flicker of respect. He unexpected dissent. The steady hum of the engines changed slightly, a subtle shift in pitch as the cabin lights brightened. A soft chime rang overhead, followed by the captain's calm voice over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've been instructed to make a brief unscheduled landing. Please remain seated with your belts fastened as we begin our descent." The announcement sent a ripple of unease through the first-class cabin. Passengers exchanged worried looks, murmurs rising as the reality set in. "Unscheduled landing? Why?" Richard Sloane leaned forward, his voice low but gleeful. "They're kicking her off. Finally. About time someone cleaned up this mess." The pearl-draped socialite smirked to her companion. "Honestly, good. Maybe now we can relax without all this drama." But not everyone seemed convinced. The businessman across the aisle frowned deeply, his gaze flicking from Carla, whose confident posture had begun to crack, to Amara, who remained perfectly calm, hands folded in her lap. Grace moved quietly through the aisle, double-checking belts, but her eyes kept drifting to Amara. Her movements were brisk, but her expression betrayed a quiet understanding. She knew this wasn't about removing a passenger for misbehavior. Something bigger was happening. Outside the cabin windows, the gray clouds parted as the plane descended toward a private runway below. From the left side of the aircraft, several passengers noticed sleek, black SUVs parked beside the tarmac, their polished exteriors glinting beneath the morning sun. Men in dark suits stood by, their postures straight, their eyes scanning the runway. The murmurs in the cabin swelled. "What's going on?" someone whispered. "Is this some security issue? Are we in danger?" Carla's face had paled slightly, though she tried to mask it with a forced smile as she leaned down to Richard. "Don't worry, sir. This will be handled quickly. She'll be off before we take off again." Amara finally moved. She glanced out the window, her gaze lingering on the SUVs below. Then she turned back to the aisle, her voice calm but carrying an edge that sent a chill through the already tense cabin. "Those cars, they're not here for me. They're here because of what's about to happen to you." The cabin went still, the soft whine of the descending engine suddenly the only sound anyone could hear. The agents arrive. The plane rolled to a smooth stop on the secluded runway. From the windows, passengers could see 3 black SUVs parked in a precise line, engines idling. Their tinted windows reflected the sunlight, giving nothing away, but the presence of several suited figures, tall, sharp, and expressionless, made the entire cabin bristle with unease. The seatbelt chime echoed as the captain's voice came over the intercom again, calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. Security personnel will be boarding shortly to address a situation. There is no danger to passengers, but we ask for your full cooperation." A wave of murmurs swept through first class. The pearl-draped socialite's smile faltered as she whispered, "Wait, why does this feel like something else entirely?" Richard Sloane leaned forward, trying to mask his unease with a smirk. "They're here to drag her off, obviously. Watch, it'll be quick." But Carla, standing near the galley, couldn't hide the tension creeping across her face. Her eyes darted toward Amara, who remained seated, posture straight, gaze calm. The cabin door opened with a sharp hiss, and 3 men in dark suits stepped inside, their movements deliberate and controlled. They weren't airline staff. Their earpieces and clipped badges made that clear. Every passenger straightened instinctively, sensing the weight of authority they carried. The lead agent, tall, with a calm, commanding presence, scanned the cabin, his gaze lingering briefly on Carla before settling on Amara. His voice was measured but unmistakably respectful. "Ms. Hale," he said with a slight nod, "we're here on behalf of the Bureau. Your contact is en route. We'll remain on board until his arrival." Gasps spread through the cabin like a wave. Passengers exchanged wide-eyed looks, whispering frantically. "The Bureau? Who is she?" Carla's composure finally cracked. Her lips parted, her voice faltering as she stammered, "Wait, what? The Bureau? For her?" The lead agent turned his gaze to her, his expression flat but cold. "Ma'am, you may want to stay silent until the situation is addressed. For your sake." Richard's smug grin evaporated as he leaned back, his eyes darting nervously between the suited men and Amara. The socialite gripped her champagne glass tighter, her earlier superiority replaced by unease. Amara finally spoke, her tone calm, deliberate, and just loud enough for those around her to hear. "You still think I don't belong here?" The words hung in the air like a blade, the murmurs around the cabin swelling as every passenger realized this was far from over. The arrival of power. The cabin was silent except for the faint hum of the engines as the agents stood near the aisle, their presence radiating quiet authority. Every passenger sat frozen, phones discreetly lowered, no one daring to make a sound. Carla, usually the most commanding presence on any flight, lingered by the galley with her hands clasped tightly, her confident mask cracking more with every passing second. Then, outside the windows, the rear SUV door opened. A tall man stepped out, dressed in a dark tailored suit, his posture commanding even from a distance. 2 additional agents flanked him as he strode toward the aircraft with measured, deliberate steps. The crew at the front of the plane straightened instinctively, sensing who he was before a word was said. Inside the cabin, Richard Sloane whispered hoarsely, "Who is that?" His earlier smugness had completely drained, replaced by unease. The pearl-draped socialite leaned closer to the window, her grip tightening on her champagne glass as if it were a lifeline. "That's no airline manager," she muttered under her breath. The cabin door opened again with a sharp hiss, and the man stepped inside. His gaze swept the room like a spotlight, cool and assessing. He paused only briefly before locking eyes with Amara, his stern expression softening for just a moment. "Amara," he said, his deep voice calm but resonant, "are you all right?" Amara's lips curved into the faintest smile. "I'm fine, Dad." Gasps rippled through the cabin. A few passengers murmured audibly, "Dad? That's her father?" While others simply stared, their earlier judgments dissolving into shock. Carla's jaw slackened as she took a step forward, her voice faltering. "Wait, you're her father?" The man turned toward her, his eyes like steel. "Special Agent Marcus Hale. Deputy Director, FBI." His voice was level, but it carried a weight that silenced the entire cabin. "And I'd like to know why my daughter was harassed, threatened, and humiliated on this flight, while your crew stood by." Carla's face went pale. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Richard Sloane sank slightly into his seat, his earlier arrogance replaced with something closer to dread. The lead agent stepped forward, his hand resting lightly on his belt. "Agent Hale, we've already taken statements from witnesses. Would you like us to begin the formal process?" Marcus Hale nodded once, his gaze still fixed on Carla. "Yes. Start with the crew. Then the passenger who led this circus." The entire cabin held its breath as the balance of power shifted completely. And for the first time since boarding, Amara leaned back in her seat, calm as ever, because now everyone understood exactly who they were dealing with. The confrontation. Marcus Hale took a single step forward, his tall frame casting a long shadow down the aisle. His presence alone seemed to shrink the space, every passenger instinctively leaning back as his measured gaze swept the cabin. His focus settled on Carla, who stood rigid near the galley, her fingers twisting around her clipboard like it could anchor her. "Ms. Mason," Marcus said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable authority, "you've got one chance to explain yourself. Why was my daughter singled out, threatened, and humiliated, in front of witnesses, while sitting in a seat she paid for?" Carla swallowed hard, her polished facade finally cracking. "Agent Hale, there must have been a misunderstanding. I thought she—" "No," Marcus interrupted, his tone sharp enough to make several passengers flinch. "You assumed. And you acted on that assumption without proof. You raised your voice to a compliant passenger, threatened to remove her, and allowed this," he gestured toward Richard Sloane, who stiffened in his seat, "to stir hostility in a cabin full of people." Richard stammered, his earlier confidence gone. I was just voicing concerns. I didn't know she was." Marcus's gaze cut to him, cold and unwavering. "You didn't need to know who she was to treat her like a human being. But you didn't. And now you'll answer for it." The pearl-draped socialite shifted uncomfortably, looking anywhere but at Amara. Grace, who had been silent in the corner, finally stepped closer, clutching the manifest. "Deputy Director, sir," she said carefully, "for what it's worth, I can confirm Ms. Hale's status. She was marked as Priority 1. Carla ignored it." Carla's lips parted, her breath catching. I didn't see." "You saw it," Marcus said, his voice like steel. "You just didn't care. That ends now." The lead agent stepped forward, his tone measured. "Sir, should we proceed with formal charges for harassment and obstruction?" Marcus gave a curt nod, his eyes never leaving Carla and Richard. "Yes. Start with them. Document everything. I'll be filing a full report with the Bureau and the airline." Gasps filled the cabin. A few passengers raised their phones higher, filming every second now without shame. Amara finally broke her silence, her voice calm but carrying across the tense room. "Respect isn't optional. Not for me. Not for anyone. This ends today." Carla's shoulders slumped as the weight of what was happening began to sink in. Richard's face had turned ashen, his hands gripping the armrests. The storm wasn't over. It had only just begun. The detainment begins. The lead agent gave a subtle hand signal, and two of the suited men stepped forward, their movements calm but deliberate as they approached Richard Sloane's row. The banker's face drained of color, his fingers gripping the armrests as if holding on could keep him in place. "Wait, hold on!" Richard blurted, his voice cracking. "I didn't do anything wrong. I was just trying to protect the integrity of first class. She didn't look like..." Marcus Hale's gaze snapped toward him, cold and unyielding. Finish that sentence, he said quietly, his tone sharp enough to cut through the air like a blade. Richard's mouth opened, but no words came. The agents flanked him, one leaning in with a firm, professional tone. Sir, you are being detained for harassment and obstruction aboard a federally regulated flight. We'll collect your statement once we're on the ground. Please stand. Richard's hands trembled as he slowly rose, his eyes darting to the pearl-draped socialite across the aisle as if she might save him. She looked away, shrinking into her seat. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder now, phones openly recording as passengers whispered to each other. He's done for. Serves him right. Who even messes with the FBI? Carla took an instinctive step back as another agent approached her. Ms. Mason, the lead agent said evenly, per Deputy Director Hale's instructions, you're to be removed from duty effective immediately. You'll be escorted off the aircraft and questioned by authorities on the ground. Carla's breath quickened. Please, this is a misunderstanding. I didn't know. Marcus's voice cut her off, firm and final. You didn't need to know who she was to do your job correctly. You just needed to treat her with respect. And you failed. Grace, standing near the galley, kept her gaze lowered, though a faint flicker of relief crossed her face. She knew the truth had finally come to light. The businessman across the aisle leaned back, his arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with quiet satisfaction. Justice, finally, he muttered under his breath. As Richard was led toward the cabin door, his protests growing fainter, Carla's knees seemed to weaken. Her clipboard slipped from her fingers, clattering softly to the floor. She didn't bother to pick it up. Amara, still seated, lifted her gaze toward the aisle. Her expression was calm, unshaken. For the first time, the entire cabin's attention was on her, not with judgment, but with a kind of reverence. And Marcus Hale turned, his voice firm but steady as he addressed the room. Let this be clear. My daughter's position had nothing to do with her right to be here. She deserved respect, just like any one of you. And because she didn't get it, those responsible will face the consequences. The cabin was silent, the weight of his words settling over everyone. Even the hum of the engines felt distant now. The walk of shame. Two agents stepped closer to Carla, their movements calm but firm. One gestured toward the aisle. Ms. Mason, please stand. You're being removed from duty effective immediately and escorted off this aircraft for questioning. Carla's face had lost all color. Her hands twitched at her sides as she glanced around the cabin, searching desperately for support, but the faces staring back at her were cold, silent, and unyielding. Even the pearl-draped socialite, who had silently cheered her on earlier, now looked down at her folded hands, unwilling to meet her gaze. Carla's voice faltered as she tried to speak. Please! I didn't mean to, I thought. Marcus Hale's voice, calm but resolute, cut through the air like a knife. You thought wrong. Repeatedly. You had multiple chances to act with professionalism, and instead you let your prejudice dictate every decision. This isn't a misunderstanding, Ms. Mason. This is accountability. The agents gestured again. Carla hesitated, her knees trembling as she finally rose from her spot. The faint sound of phones recording buzzed through the silence as passengers tilted their devices slightly, capturing every second of her fall from authority. As she walked down the aisle, escorted by the agents, the hum of the engines felt louder, almost oppressive. A few passengers whispered under their breath. Unbelievable. About time she got what was coming. She acted untouchable, now look at her. Carla's heels clicked softly against the carpet, but her once confident stride had turned stiff and shaky. Her eyes burned, though no tears fell, as the cabin door came closer with every step. Before she reached it, Marcus spoke again, his voice carrying over the low murmurs. Grace, he said, turning toward the younger flight attendant who stood frozen near the galley. You did your job. You tried to do the right thing when no one else would. People like you are the reason passengers can still feel safe on these flights. Grace blinked, startled, her fingers still gripping the manifest she'd been holding like a shield. I was just trying to make sure everything was done properly, sir, she said quietly. Marcus nodded once, his tone softening. And you'll be recognized for that. My office will be in touch. Grace's eyes widened, gratitude flickering across her face as she nodded silently. Carla paused for the briefest moment at the cabin door, her lips parting as though to say something, maybe an apology, maybe an excuse, but the lead agent's firm hand on her shoulder urged her forward. She stepped off the plane without another word. And as the door hissed shut behind her, a heavy silence hung over the cabin, broken only by the faint click of phones being tucked away and the sound of passengers exhaling, almost in unison. The banker's fall. Richard Sloane sat rigid in his seat, his knuckles white against the leather armrests as two agents turned their attention toward him. His bravado was gone, replaced by a nervous tremor in his voice as he tried to salvage whatever dignity he could muster. Look. I didn't know who she was, Richard stammered, his eyes darting toward Marcus Hale. I wasn't trying to cause trouble. I just thought. Marcus cut him off with a cold stare, his tone measured but sharp. You thought you had the right to humiliate another passenger because of your assumptions. That makes you part of the problem, Mr. Sloane. And now, just like Ms. Mason, you're going to face the consequences. The agents gestured for him to stand. Richard hesitated, looking around the cabin for support, but like Carla moments earlier, all he found were cold, silent stares. The pearl-draped socialite who had been smirking earlier now adjusted her scarf and looked away, avoiding his eyes completely. Richard's voice cracked as he tried again. Come on, this isn't necessary. I didn't touch anyone. The lead agent leaned in, his voice calm but firm. Sir, you incited hostility aboard a federally regulated flight. That is considered interference. You'll give your statement on the ground. As he was guided out of his seat, Richard's face flushed a deep crimson. He straightened his expensive coat as if trying to cling to some shred of pride, but his trembling hands betrayed him. The murmurs in the cabin swelled. Guess money can't buy everything. Thought he owned the place, now look. He was the loudest one, now he's the quietest. Amara's gaze followed him, her face calm and unreadable. She didn't say a word as he passed, but her eyes met his for the briefest moment, a quiet reminder of the power he had underestimated. Richard quickly averted his gaze, his pace quickening as he was escorted toward the cabin door. As the agent stepped off the plane with him, the door sealed shut once more. A heavy silence fell across first class, every passenger keenly aware of how quickly the balance of power had shifted. Marcus Hale turned toward the seated passengers, his posture tall and steady. His deep voice broke the silence. Let me make this clear to all of you, he said evenly. This isn't about who my daughter is. This is about how she, and anyone else, deserves to be treated. Today was a lesson. For some, a painful one. Amara, finally lifting her chin, let her gaze sweep across the room. Calm, collected, her voice soft but resonant. Respect, she said, isn't optional. And today, some people learned that the hard way. The murmurs quieted completely. Every eye was on her now, not with disdain, not with judgment, but with something closer to awe. Order restored. Marcus Hale stood tall at the front of the first-class cabin, his commanding presence holding every passenger's attention. The agents had stepped aside now, forming a quiet line near the door, but the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air like static. He let the silence settle for a moment before speaking, his voice deep and measured. What happened on this flight today is something I've seen far too often. People who believe they're entitled to decide who belongs, and who doesn't. People who think appearances give them the right to humiliate others. The cabin was silent. Even the hum of the engines felt distant as his words carried through the space. My daughter didn't need me to stand up for her. She's more than capable on her own. But this was never about her being my daughter. It's about principle. Respect is not negotiable. Not here, not anywhere. His gaze shifted to Grace, the young flight attendant standing near the galley with the manifest still clutched to her chest. She straightened instinctively under his stare, her posture stiff, unsure. Grace, Marcus said, his voice softening slightly, you were the only one on this crew who tried to do the right thing. You checked the manifest. You questioned what was happening, even when it could have cost you your job. That's integrity. Grace's breath caught, her eyes widening slightly. I just wanted to make sure everything was done fairly, sir, she said, her voice quiet but steady. And you did, Marcus replied. The Bureau will make sure your actions are recognized. You've proven what professionalism is supposed to look like. A ripple of whispers moved through the cabin. Some passengers nodded subtly, others exchanged glances, clearly realizing who among the crew had actually tried to do her job correctly. Marcus turned back to the seated passengers, his tone returning to that steady, commanding weight. For the rest of this flight, there will be no more disruptions. No more hostility. Everyone here will be treated with the dignity they paid for, the dignity every human being deserves, regardless of who they are. Amara finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. And if anyone still feels the need to question who belongs here, remember what happened to the ones who did. The pearl-draped socialite lowered her gaze to her lap, her hands twisting in her silk scarf. No one spoke a word in challenge. Marcus gave a final nod to the agents, who stepped back toward their positions near the exit, then gestured to Captain Reeves, who had been silently observing from near the cockpit door. Captain, Marcus said evenly, let's resume our journey. I believe we can all agree this matter is settled. Reeves gave a single nod and returned to the cockpit. Moments later, the captain's voice came over the intercom, calm as ever. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be departing shortly. Thank you for your patience. The engines began to hum louder, preparing for takeoff again. And for the first time since the flight began, the cabin felt still. Controlled. But every passenger knew they had just witnessed something they'd never forget. Whispers at 30,000 feet. The engines roared back to life as the plane taxied along the runway, climbing smoothly into the sky once more. But even as first class settled into its usual rhythm, the soft chime of the seatbelt light, glasses clinking faintly as drinks were poured, the cabin still buzzed with a low, electric tension. Passengers whispered in hushed tones, leaning close to one another. The pearl-draped socialite, now unusually quiet, muttered to her companion. She didn't even raise her voice once. And yet, look what happened. Her companion nodded silently, avoiding Amara's gaze as though afraid to be noticed. Across the aisle, the businessman who had stood up earlier leaned slightly forward, catching Amara's eye. His voice was low, almost conspiratorial. Most people would have shouted or argued. You didn't have to. That says everything. Amara gave him the faintest nod of acknowledgement but said nothing. Her calm presence was louder than any response she could have given. Grace, still standing near the galley, hesitated before stepping toward Amara's row. Her hands fidgeted nervously with the corner of the manifest she still held, as if she didn't quite know if she should approach. Finally, she took a quiet step closer and spoke in a soft, careful tone. Ms. Hale. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for what you went through. And, thank you for not holding it against me. I tried, but, her voice trailed off as her eyes flickered toward the empty seats where Carla and Richard had been. Amara's gaze softened slightly as she turned toward Grace. You didn't let fear stop you from doing what was right. That matters more than you know. Grace blinked, her shoulders relaxing for the first time since the ordeal began. Thank you, she murmured, her voice barely audible over the faint hum of the engines. The businessman smirked faintly, his tone just loud enough for Grace to hear. Looks like you might be the only one walking away from this flight with a promotion. A few nearby passengers, who had overheard, chuckled softly. The tension in the cabin began to ease, but only slightly. The memory of what had happened still hung in the air, like a shadow none of them could shake. Amara rested her phone on the armrest again, her posture composed, her gaze shifting briefly toward the window where the clouds stretched endlessly beyond the glass. Outside, the sunlight broke through the overcast sky, casting a warm glow across her seat. It felt like the first moment of peace all flight, but the weight of what had happened still lingered with every passenger who had witnessed it. And they all knew, this wasn't over. Not really. The quiet warning. The cabin lights dimmed as the flight settled into cruising altitude once again. The tension had dulled but not vanished. It lingered, a quiet heaviness beneath the hum of the engines. Most passengers had stopped whispering, but every so often, a pair of hushed voices would rise, trading fragments of questions they were too nervous to ask out loud. At the front of the cabin, Marcus Hale stood near the cockpit door, speaking quietly with Captain Reeves. His voice carried just enough to reach the first 2 rows. "I'll be filing a full report with the Bureau and the airline. This crew will face a formal review. The incident will not disappear when we land." Reeves nodded, his posture stiff but respectful. "Understood, Deputy Director. I'll ensure the full flight log and crew statements are sent directly to your office before the day is over." Marcus's eyes, sharp and unwavering, swept once toward the remaining crew members, just 2 junior attendants now, both visibly uneasy under his gaze. "Make no mistake," he said, his tone low but deliberate, "this flight is being monitored until touchdown. Any more mistakes like what we saw earlier, and the Bureau will handle it personally." Both attendants nodded quickly, their eyes dropping to the floor. Meanwhile, Amara sat quietly in her seat, her gaze fixed on the clouds streaking past outside the window. Her phone rested face up on the armrest, a single unread message glowing softly on the screen. She didn't reach for it. She didn't need to. Across the aisle, the businessman leaned toward her slightly. "You know," he murmured, "after all that, people are going to want to know who you really are. I can already see the headlines." Amara turned her head just enough to meet his eyes, her expression calm but unreadable. "They don't need to know," she said softly. "All they need to remember is what happens when you treat someone like they don't belong." The businessman nodded slowly, leaning back in his seat. "Fair enough. That's a lesson they won't forget anytime soon." Grace, still standing near the galley, glanced toward Amara, her face a mixture of gratitude and awe. She whispered under her breath, almost to herself, "I've never seen someone handle a situation like that, without even raising their voice." Amara didn't react, didn't even turn her head. She simply closed her eyes for a brief moment, her breathing steady. The chaos had passed, but her silence carried more weight than any speech could. And the cabin, once buzzing with judgment and whispers, had fallen into a strange, reverent quiet. Father and daughter. Marcus Hale finally stepped away from the cockpit and moved down the aisle, his steady footsteps drawing every passenger's attention. He stopped beside Amara's row and rested a hand lightly on the back of the empty seat next to her. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, his deep voice carrying the same calm authority as before. Amara's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "It's your plane as much as mine," she replied, gesturing to the open seat. Marcus lowered himself into it, his posture as straight as ever. For a moment, he didn't speak, simply glancing around the cabin. Most of the passengers quickly averted their eyes, pretending to busy themselves with drinks or magazines. The only one who didn't look away was the businessman, who offered a quiet nod of respect before turning back to his tablet. Finally, Marcus spoke, his tone softer now. "You handled yourself better than most people in your position would have. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't let anger make you reckless." He paused, his gaze lingering on her calm expression. "You let the facts, and the right people, do the talking." Amara tilted her head, her voice quiet but steady. "I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me lose control. They already decided I didn't belong here. Why prove them right by acting out?" Marcus gave a faint nod, his eyes softening. "That restraint is why you'll never need me to step in. But it's also why I did. Because sometimes, the point isn't just about you. It's about making sure everyone who watched this knows that what happened here isn't acceptable anywhere." Amara's gaze drifted toward the window for a moment, where the clouds rolled endlessly beneath them. "Do you think they'll actually learn anything from it?" she asked. Marcus glanced toward the other passengers, many of whom were still sneaking quick, uneasy glances at the two of them. His voice was calm but firm. "They'll remember it. Whether they change, that's on them. But they'll think twice before doing it again. That's enough." A beat of silence passed before Amara murmured, almost to herself, "Respect isn't given freely." Sometimes, you have to make the world remember what it looks like. Marcus's lips curved into the faintest trace of a smile. Exactly. And you just reminded a plane full of strangers the hard way. The faint hum of the engines filled the momentary quiet between them as Marcus leaned back, his eyes briefly closing, while Amara remained still, poised, unshaken, and more in control than anyone else on board. The quiet thanks. The cabin lights had dimmed to a soft glow as the flight cruised above the clouds, but the atmosphere in first class remained unusually heavy. Most passengers sat quietly, their earlier whispers replaced by sidelong glances toward Amara and her father. The businessman across the aisle, who had been silent since Marcus sat down, finally leaned forward slightly. His voice was low, careful not to draw attention. "Miss Hale," he said, "I just wanted to say, thank you. Not just for standing your ground, but for how you did it. Most people would have yelled. You didn't have to." Amara's gaze shifted to meet his. Calm, unflinching. "Yelling would have given them the excuse they were looking for," she said softly. "Sometimes, silence is louder." The businessman nodded, a faint smile crossing his face. "Well, it worked. You didn't just prove your point. You made everyone else see it too." Before Amara could reply, Grace approached cautiously, her steps light, almost hesitant. She paused a few feet away, her fingers gripping the manifest she still hadn't let go of. Her voice was soft but steady as she spoke. "Ms. Hale, I know I already said this, but I wanted to ask, are you going to report me along with the rest of the crew?" Her eyes flickered with a mix of fear and hope. "I know I didn't do enough to stop it, but I tried. I don't want to lose my job for something I couldn't control." Amara studied her for a long moment, her calm gaze assessing but not cold. "You won't be reported," she said finally, her voice carrying the same quiet certainty as before. "You're not the problem, Grace. You're the example." Grace exhaled, her shoulders lowering in visible relief. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus, still seated beside his daughter, turned his attention briefly to Grace. "The Bureau will note your actions," he said firmly. "You stood on the side of what was right, even when it was difficult. That's worth recognition, not punishment." Grace nodded quickly, a flicker of gratitude crossing her face before she stepped back toward the galley, her posture straighter now than it had been all flight. The businessman leaned back in his seat, a faint smirk on his lips. "Looks like at least one person will be walking off this flight with good news," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Amara turned back toward the window, her reflection faintly visible in the dark glass. Her posture didn't shift, her expression as composed as ever. But in the faint glint of her eyes, there was something deeper, not triumph, not pride, but a quiet resolve. The hum of the engines filled the silence once more, a soft, steady backdrop as the cabin seemed to exhale, finally settling after the chaos. Setting a precedent. The steady hum of the engines filled the cabin as Marcus leaned back slightly in his seat, his posture still upright and composed. His gaze remained fixed on the dark horizon beyond the window, but his words were directed at Amara. "You know this won't just end when we land," he said, his voice calm but firm. "What happened here today will be documented. It won't be buried as just another ugly incident on a flight. The Bureau will use it as a case study, not because you're my daughter, but because it's exactly the kind of behavior we need to hold accountable." Amara's eyes stayed on the faint reflection of herself in the glass. "I didn't want a scene," she murmured. "All I wanted was to be treated like anyone else. But I knew the second I boarded, they weren't going to see me that way." Marcus nodded slowly. "And that's why this has to be more than personal. It's not about humiliation, or even justice for you. It's about making sure that when the next woman, or man, walks onto a flight like this, they're not treated like an intruder because of how they look." Amara tilted her head, her voice still quiet, steady. "And do you think anyone here actually learned that lesson? Or will they just whisper about who I am so they don't feel guilty about what they saw?" Marcus's eyes drifted toward the rows ahead, where passengers sat stiffly, some sneaking occasional glances back at the two of them but quickly looking away when caught. "They'll whisper. They'll gossip. But they'll also remember. And the next time they think about treating someone the way Carla and Sloane treated you, they'll hesitate. A beat of silence passed before Marcus added, his tone lower, almost reflective, sometimes fear of consequence is the first step toward real change. If they're too stubborn to feel shame, at least they'll feel hesitation. And that might save someone else the ordeal you just went through. Amara finally turned her head to face him, her expression calm but resolute. Then I guess it was worth it. Marcus gave the faintest nod, his lips curving into something close to a smile. It was. More than you know. Across the cabin, Grace quietly observed from near the galley, her posture straighter, her chin lifted slightly now. The businessman glanced between the two Hales, a faint look of respect in his eyes, before returning to his tablet. And as the plane soared quietly through the night sky, the weight of what had happened still hung in the cabin, not as tension, but as something heavier, a reminder. The landing in the spotlight. The soft chime of the intercom broke the heavy stillness in the cabin. Captain Reeves' voice came over the speakers, calm but deliberate. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please remain seated with your belts fastened. Ground personnel will be present to assist with our arrival. Outside the windows, the glow of runway lights grew closer, stretching in long, bright lines against the darkness. The hum of the engine softened as the plane began its descent, gliding smoothly toward the tarmac. From the left side of the cabin, a few passengers noticed flashing lights in the distance. Several black SUVs were parked near the private terminal, their headlights cutting through the dark. Next to them, a cluster of camera crews stood behind a roped-off area, their lenses glinting in the light. Whispers rose immediately, low but sharp. The press is here? Is this about her? Who is she, really? The pearl-draped socialite leaned toward her companion, her voice hushed but urgent. If she's not famous already, she will be after this. Look at those cameras. Grace stood near the galley, her fingers tightening around the manifest as she glanced toward Amara. Her voice, barely audible, slipped out like a thought she hadn't meant to speak aloud. She didn't want this attention, but it's coming anyway. Marcus remained calm, seated beside his daughter, his posture straight as the plane's wheels touched the ground with a soft jolt. The faint screech of the landing gear faded into a rolling hum as the aircraft slowed along the runway. He glanced toward Amara, his tone low and steady. Press is here. I'll handle them. You don't need to say a word unless you want to. Amara's eyes didn't leave the window, where the SUVs and cameras grew closer. Her reflection in the glass was calm, but her voice carried a quiet edge. Let them watch. Maybe they'll finally understand this wasn't just a tantrum or some viral drama. Maybe they'll understand what respect actually looks like, and what happens when it's denied. The plane eased to a stop near the private terminal. The agents by the door straightened, one of them speaking quietly into an earpiece. The cabin's murmurs fell into silence again, every passenger now focused on the black SUVs outside and the man beside Amara, the man who had shifted the entire balance of this flight. And as the cabin door hissed open, the first flash of camera bulbs illuminated the interior like a sudden storm of light. Marcus Hale rose to his feet, his deep voice calm but commanding as he looked toward the passengers. Stay seated. This will be quick. Then, with a final glance at Amara, he stepped into the light. The public statement. The flashing camera lights spilled into the cabin as Marcus Hale stepped onto the jet bridge, his tall frame silhouetted against the glow of the runway. The suited agents formed a barrier between the press and the plane, but microphones still reached out like eager hands, reporters shouting questions over one another. Deputy Director Hale, what happened on this flight? Is it true a senior flight attendant was removed? Why was the FBI involved in a commercial flight dispute? Marcus lifted one hand slightly, and the noise quieted almost instantly. His voice, deep and measured, carried across the flashing lights and restless murmurs. There was an incident aboard this flight, he began, his tone calm but firm. My daughter, Amara Hale, was singled out, harassed, and humiliated by a senior crew member and a passenger, not because of anything she did, but because of how she looked. Multiple witnesses confirmed this. Those responsible have been removed and will face legal and professional consequences. A ripple of flashes followed his words, But no one interrupted. The weight in his voice demanded silence. "This is not about who my daughter is," Marcus continued, his gaze sweeping across the press line. "This is about how every person, no matter their appearance, wealth, or connections, deserves to be treated. Respect is not a luxury. It is the minimum standard we must hold each other to, especially in public spaces." From the cabin windows, a few passengers peered out, their faces lit by the strobes of the cameras. The pearl-draped socialite shrank slightly in her seat, muttering to her companion, "If they pan to us, people will know we didn't say a word." Marcus's voice deepened, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "Let this serve as a reminder, prejudice and humiliation have no place here. Not on my watch. Not on any flight. And for those who stood by and did nothing, I hope this moment reminds you that silence is not neutrality. Silence is complicity." The murmurs among the press hushed completely. The only sounds were the clicking of shutters and the faint hum of the SUVs idling nearby. Marcus stepped back, signaling the agents to escort him toward the waiting convoy. But before he turned away fully, he added, "The airline will release a full statement. My office will ensure this incident is investigated to the fullest extent. No one is above accountability." The flashes erupted again as he moved down the jet bridge, his figure swallowed by the darkness outside the floodlights. Inside the cabin, Amara sat still, her phone resting face up on the armrest. She didn't move to join her father. She didn't need to. Her presence alone, silent, poised, unshaken, was enough to leave the entire cabin in stunned reflection. The cabin in reflection. The camera flashes outside dimmed slightly as Marcus disappeared toward the black SUVs, but the glow from the runway still seeped through the cabin windows. Inside, the passengers sat in uneasy silence, their whispered conversations barely audible over the faint hum of the cooling engines. The pearl-draped socialite clutched her silk scarf, her voice a hushed whisper to her companion. "We didn't say a word. Not when that flight attendant was berating her, not when Sloan was taunting her. If they show us on the news, everyone will know we just sat here." Her companion, staring at the floor, murmured, "Then maybe we deserve to feel uncomfortable. Maybe that's the point." Across the aisle, the businessman who had spoken up earlier shifted in his seat, his calm voice carrying just enough to reach a few nearby passengers. It wasn't just about her being the deputy director's daughter. It was about the way we all stayed silent, even when we knew it was wrong. "I won't make that mistake again." A couple of passengers glanced down at their phones, scrolling nervously through social media as early clips from the press conference, Marcus's voice echoing over flashing lights, began to circulate online. Whispers rippled through the rows. "Do you think they'll show our faces?" "Maybe not, but people will talk. And they'll know we just watched." Grace lingered near the galley, her hands no longer fidgeting with the manifest. Her posture had changed. She stood straighter, her chin higher, though her expression was still thoughtful. Her voice, soft but steady, carried across the few feet between her and Amara. "They're realizing it now," Grace said quietly. "Not just what they let happen, but what they chose not to stop." Amara's gaze drifted to Grace, calm and unflinching. "Good," she replied softly. "Maybe the discomfort will stay with them long enough to change how they act next time." The businessman glanced at Amara from across the aisle. "You don't plan on making a public statement, do you?" Amara's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. "No. My father already said everything that needs to be said. I don't need to add to it." Outside, the camera flashes picked up again as another convoy vehicle rolled into position. The cabin door remained closed, but every passenger inside could feel it. This wasn't just a flight anymore. It was a story. One that would follow them long after they left the plane. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the soft chime of the captain's voice over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be disembarking shortly. Please remain seated until directed." And with that, the weight in the air grew heavier, every passenger left alone with the question none of them could quite ignore: what will people say when this goes public, and our faces are in the background? The silent exit. The soft ding of the intercom echoed through the cabin as Captain Reeves' calm voice filled the air. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin disembarkation in a few moments. Please remain seated until your row is called. The cabin, still tense, shifted slightly as passengers adjusted in their seats. A few people instinctively straightened their jackets or fixed their hair, as if the cameras waiting outside might catch them in the background. The pearl-draped socialite leaned to her companion, her whisper barely audible. If they film us, we'll look like cowards. We were cowards. Her companion didn't reply, eyes fixed on the floor. Grace moved quietly through the aisle, checking belts and compartments one final time. She paused beside Amara's row, her voice low, almost hesitant. Ms. Hale, do you want to wait until last? Or leave first, with the agents? Amara's gaze remained forward, her posture perfectly straight. I'll leave last, she said softly. Let them see what patience looks like. The businessman across the aisle gave a quiet nod of approval. Make them sweat a little longer, he muttered, his lips curling into the faintest smirk. One by one, the rows ahead began to file out, each passenger moving briskly down the aisle, trying to keep their heads low as the flashes from the jet bridge grew brighter. The murmurs outside, the low hum of reporters and photographers, drifted into the cabin like a rising tide. When the final few rows cleared, the agents near the exit turned toward Amara. Ms. Hale, one said respectfully, we're ready when you are. Amara rose smoothly, adjusting her blazer with calm precision. She glanced briefly toward Grace. You did your job. Keep doing it, she said quietly, before stepping into the aisle. As she moved down the cabin, the businessman gave her a respectful nod. Safe travels, Ms. Hale. And, thank you. For reminding everyone what real composure looks like. She inclined her head slightly but didn't break stride. The cabin door opened, and the storm of flashing lights poured in, a staccato burst of camera shutters and muted voices calling her name. Amara didn't flinch. She didn't wave, didn't speak, didn't acknowledge the chaos beyond the door. She simply walked forward, her calm presence cutting through the chaos like a blade. The agents flanked her as she descended the steps to the tarmac, the flashes intensifying with every step. But Amara's gaze stayed fixed ahead, steady and unshaken, as though none of it touched her. And when she reached the SUV waiting at the bottom of the steps, she paused only long enough to glance back at the plane, a silent reminder to everyone watching that she wasn't leaving defeated. She was leaving in control. Without a word, she stepped into the vehicle, the door closing softly behind her. The flashes dimmed as the SUV pulled away from the runway, leaving the murmurs of the press and the uneasy passengers behind. Inside the cabin, Grace exhaled quietly, muttering to herself, that's how you leave a storm, without letting it touch you. Grace meets Marcus. The cabin had mostly emptied now, leaving only Grace, the remaining junior attendant, and a handful of ground staff collecting loose items. The last murmurs of the other passengers faded as they disappeared down the jet bridge, leaving behind a quiet that felt almost strange after the chaos of the flight. Grace adjusted her uniform jacket, her fingers brushing nervously against the folded manifest still tucked into her pocket. She hesitated for a moment at the galley, glancing toward the open cabin door where the flashing lights outside had finally begun to dim. Then, drawing a steady breath, she stepped forward. As she descended the steps to the tarmac, the cool night air hit her, carrying with it the faint hum of the engines and the distant chatter of reporters still lingering by the roped-off press area. The black SUVs remained idling near the terminal, their polished frames reflecting the bright runway lights. Marcus Hale stood beside the lead vehicle, speaking quietly with one of the suited agents. When his gaze shifted toward Grace, she instinctively straightened, her posture stiff. For a moment, she thought about retreating back to the plane, but his expression wasn't cold. It was assessing, measured. Grace, Marcus said, his deep voice calm but carrying that same authority as before. Step over here for a moment. She approached cautiously, her hands clasped in front of her. Yes, Deputy Director, she asked, her voice soft but steady. Marcus studied her for a beat, his eyes steady but not unkind. I wanted to tell you personally, you handled yourself better than most on that plane. You didn't ignore the manifest. You tried to speak up, even when your superiors shut you down. That kind of integrity is rare. Grace's breath caught, her fingers tightening around the manifest at her side. I was just doing my job, sir. I didn't want things to get worse for her. Or anyone. Marcus nodded. And because of that, my office will be reaching out to your airline. You'll be commended formally, and we'll make sure you're considered for promotion. This kind of behavior deserves to be recognized. For a moment, Grace could only stare, her eyes widening slightly. Then she gave a small nod, her voice low but firm. Thank you, sir. I didn't expect this. Marcus's gaze softened just slightly. People who do the right thing rarely do. But they're the ones who deserve it most. He gestured toward one of the SUVs. Go ahead. They'll take you to the terminal. Someone will follow up with you tomorrow about the report. Grace hesitated, glancing once toward the vehicle Amara had already left in. Will Ms. Hale be all right? After all this attention? Marcus's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. She's more than all right. Trust me, she doesn't need anyone to fight her battles. Today just proved it. Grace nodded silently, stepping toward the SUV as Marcus turned back to his agents. The sound of the door closing behind her was soft, but final. For the first time all evening, she let herself exhale fully, the tension finally leaving her shoulders. The quiet ride. Inside the SUV, the noise of the runway faded into a soft, insulated hush. The tinted windows muted the flashes of cameras outside as the vehicle pulled away from the terminal, gliding smoothly along the private access road. Amara sat on one side of the back seat, her posture as straight as ever, her gaze fixed on the distant city lights beyond the glass. She hadn't spoken since stepping into the car. Her phone rested in her lap, its screen dark. Marcus slid into the seat across from her, closing the door with a quiet thud. For a moment, the only sound in the cabin was the low hum of the tires against the asphalt. He watched her silently, noting the calm stillness she carried even now, long after the chaos had ended. You didn't say a word out there, Marcus said finally, his voice low, deliberate. Not to the press. Not to anyone on that plane. Most people would have wanted to make a statement. Amara turned her head slightly, her expression unreadable. You already said everything that needed to be said. I didn't need to repeat it. Besides, she looked back toward the window. Sometimes silence speaks louder. They'll remember the image more than the words. Marcus nodded slowly, his gaze steady. And what image do you think they'll remember? Her lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, not prideful, but measured. Not a victim. Not a headline. Just someone they underestimated, walking away without a scratch. The SUV glided past a row of quiet hangars, the city skyline growing brighter in the distance. Marcus leaned back slightly, his voice softer now. This won't just be a story for the news cycle. The Bureau will use this as leverage with the airline. Policies will change because of tonight. And the people who watched, they won't forget. Amara's eyes stayed on the city lights as she murmured, good. They don't need to know who I am to know they crossed the line. They just need to remember the consequences. A brief silence filled the space, calm but weighted. Marcus studied his daughter for a long moment before saying quietly, You handled yourself better than anyone I know. I didn't step in because you needed me. I stepped in because the lesson had to be bigger than just you. Amara finally met his eyes, her voice even. And it was. They'll think twice next time. Marcus gave a faint nod, his lips pressing into something like a restrained smile. That's all we needed. The SUV turned off the access road, merging onto a private lane toward a secured downtown hotel. The city lights bathed the windows in a faint glow, the chaos of the flight now far behind them, but the weight of what had happened lingering like a shadow neither of them needed to acknowledge aloud. The media frenzy. The SUV slowed as it approached the hotel's private entrance, its tinted windows reflecting the flashing storm of lights waiting just beyond the barricades. Reporters clustered near the velvet ropes, their voices rising over one another in a chaotic symphony of questions and camera shutters. Ms. Hale, will you be pressing charges? Is it true the airline staff physically threatened you? Deputy Director Hale, is the Bureau stepping in officially? The convoy's lead agent stepped out first, his hand raised as he signaled for the press to hold their distance. Two more agents flanked the SUV as Marcus exited, his tall frame commanding instant silence from the crowd. His expression was calm, his movements deliberate as he turned to open the rear door. Amara stepped out slowly, her posture perfectly straight, her chin lifted just enough to exude quiet confidence without arrogance. The flashes intensified, reflecting off her blazer as the reporters surged forward slightly, only to be stopped by the agent's outstretched arms. Marcus glanced at his daughter. "You sure you don't want to say something?" he murmured low enough for only her to hear. Amara's gaze swept across the wall of flashing cameras and eager faces, her expression calm and unshaken. "No," she said softly. "They'll talk enough without me. Silence will say more than any speech." The reporters shouted questions again, their voices echoing through the entranceway, but Amara didn't respond. She didn't look at the cameras or the crowd. She simply walked forward, her measured steps cutting through the chaos with an ease that drew every lens toward her. The pearl-draped socialite, still standing with a few disembarked passengers near the curb, watched as Amara passed. She whispered to her companion, almost awed, "She doesn't even need to speak, and somehow, she owns every second of this." Marcus raised a hand subtly, signaling the agents to keep the press back as the pair approached the revolving doors. Before stepping inside, he paused and cast one final glance toward the cameras. His deep voice, calm but unmistakable, cut through the noise. "This isn't about titles, money, or power," he said, his tone carrying across the barricades. "This is about dignity. My daughter didn't ask for this attention, but she got it because others forgot that respect is not optional. Let tonight remind everyone of that." The flashes erupted again, but neither Marcus nor Amara lingered. They stepped into the hotel, the doors closing softly behind them, muting the chaos outside into silence. Inside, the lobby's warm lighting felt almost surreal after the frenzy. Amara exhaled quietly, her composure never breaking, even as she murmured, "You know this story will be everywhere by morning." Marcus glanced at her, his voice steady. "Good. Some lessons deserve to be broadcast." Behind closed doors. The elevator chimed softly as Marcus and Amara stepped into the top-floor suite, the heavy door closing behind them with a muted thud. The city skyline sprawled beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, its lights twinkling in the distance like a quiet, indifferent audience. Inside the room, the chaos of the night felt distant, muted by the plush carpet, the low hum of the air conditioning, and the sheer quiet that filled the space. Amara walked toward the window, her blazer still perfectly in place, her posture as poised as it had been since the ordeal began. She set her phone on the table by the glass, its screen lighting briefly with a flood of unread notifications before going dark again. For the first time all evening, she exhaled a slow, steady breath. Her hands, still and composed during the flight, trembled just faintly as she rested them on the edge of the table. Not from fear, but from the release of tension she carried without letting anyone see it. Marcus stepped farther into the suite, his keen eyes catching the subtle shift in her stance. "You held it together," he said quietly, his voice softer now, lacking the commanding weight it had carried all night. "Most people would have broken, shouted, cried, something. But you didn't." Amara didn't turn from the window. "I couldn't," she said, her voice even but quieter than before. "The second I showed weakness, it would have become another story. Not about what they did, but about how I reacted." Marcus nodded, understanding. "And now?" Her reflection in the glass was steady, but her shoulders lowered slightly, just enough to betray the exhaustion beneath her composure. "Now I let myself feel it. Not because it hurt me, but because carrying it without showing it takes more out of you than anyone realizes." Marcus walked closer, his tone measured. "This won't be the last time something like this happens. But tonight set a precedent. For the airline. For everyone who watched. And for you." Amara finally turned to face him, her expression calm but tinged with weariness. "For me?" He nodded. "You proved, without words, that control is more powerful than outrage. And that's something people will remember, whether they want to admit it or not. A faint, tired smile flickered across her lips. Control and consequences. Marcus allowed the corners of his mouth to lift just slightly. Exactly. Amara reached for her phone, silencing the constant buzzing of alerts and messages, and set it face down. For tonight. I don't care what the world is saying. I just want quiet. Marcus gave a slight nod, stepping toward the suite's adjoining room. Then get some rest. Tomorrow, the noise starts. But tonight, you earned the silence. Amara turned back to the city lights, her posture softening just enough to let her guard lower. For the first time all night, she allowed her eyes to close, if only for a moment, as the distant hum of the city became the only sound she heard. The storm outside. Morning sunlight spilled across the suite, casting soft golden lines over the hardwood floor. The city outside buzzed awake, its sounds muffled through the glass but unmistakable, sirens, car horns, and the distant hum of a skyline alive with movement. Amara sat by the window, a cup of untouched coffee resting on the table beside her. Her phone, still face down, buzzed every few seconds with new alerts, notifications stacking endlessly from news outlets, social media, and unknown numbers demanding statements. She didn't reach for it. Instead, her gaze stayed fixed on the muted television across the room, where every major network played clips from the night before. Marcus's voice from the press line echoed through the speakers. Respect is not optional. Not here, not anywhere. Those responsible will face consequences. The footage cut to shaky cell phone videos from passengers on the plane, Carla's sharp commands, Richard Sloane's smug remarks, the stunned silence when agents boarded. The camera panned over rows of faces, many ducking their heads, others frozen in uncomfortable stillness. The words humiliation at 30,000 feet scrolled across the bottom of the screen. The anchor's voice followed, calm but cutting. This incident has sparked outrage online, with many questioning not just the behavior of the crew and one passenger, but also the silence of those who watched without stepping in. Hashtags like #respect is mandatory and #silent witnesses are now trending globally. Amara took a slow breath, finally turning her eyes away from the screen to the city skyline. Her voice, soft and measured, broke the stillness. They're not just talking about what happened to me. They're talking about everyone who let it happen. From the adjoining room, Marcus stepped out, already dressed, his phone in hand as he wrapped up a quiet call. Good, he said simply, slipping the phone into his pocket. The more they talk, the more this becomes a lesson, not just a headline. He crossed the room, standing beside her at the window. The airline is cooperating. Carla's finished. Sloane's facing charges. Grace is already being fast-tracked for recognition. This will have an effect. Amara tilted her head slightly, her eyes still on the skyline. And me? What do I do while the world eats up every detail? Marcus's expression softened, his tone steady. Nothing. You already did what needed to be done. The silence, the control, it's more powerful than any interview or statement could ever be. Let the footage speak for itself. The phone buzzed again on the table, another flood of messages lighting the dark screen. Amara didn't move to answer. She let it ring out, her reflection in the window as calm as the morning light around her. Then I'll stay quiet, she murmured. They can write their headlines. I already said enough without saying a word. Marcus gave a slight nod, watching the skyline with her as the sun climbed higher, bathing the city in a quiet glow. The noise outside grew louder, but in the suite, there was only stillness. The final step. By late afternoon, the streets outside the hotel were crowded. News vans lined the block, their satellite dishes pointed skyward, while reporters stood behind barricades, microphones poised. The buzz of cameras and chatter created a steady hum, like a hive surrounding the entrance. Inside the lobby, the air was still, hushed, the faint sound of jazz playing softly in the background. Amara stood near the glass doors, her blazer perfectly fitted, her posture calm and unyielding. Marcus stood beside her, speaking quietly with one of the agents. Are you sure you want to step out there? Marcus asked, his tone low but careful. You don't need to. You've already made your point. Amara's eyes stayed fixed on the throng of cameras and flashing lights beyond the glass. If I don't, they'll write their own ending. I'd rather let them see it for themselves. Marcus studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. Then remember, you don't need to say anything. Just walk. They'll know exactly what it means. The glass door slid open with a soft hiss, and the sound of shouting voices and camera shutters poured into the quiet lobby. The agents moved ahead first, parting the crowd just enough for Amara and Marcus to step through. The moment she appeared, the noise surged, reporters calling her name, flashes exploding like fireworks. But Amara didn't flinch. She didn't wave. She didn't speak. She simply walked forward, her chin lifted, her pace measured and deliberate. The sunlight caught the edge of her blazer, a subtle glow following her as she moved down the steps toward the waiting SUV. Whispers rippled through the crowd despite the chaos. She's not saying a word. She doesn't have to. Look at her, she's not a victim. She's untouchable. Marcus followed a step behind, his tall frame a quiet shield as the agents kept the press at bay. They reached the SUV, its polished exterior reflecting the swarm of cameras, and Amara paused for the briefest moment before getting in. She turned her head slightly, her calm gaze sweeping over the sea of lenses and microphones. Not defiant, not triumphant, simply composed, a silent reminder of the power she held without a single word. Then, without breaking that stillness, she stepped into the vehicle. The door closed with a soft click, muffling the chaos outside. The SUV pulled away slowly, the flashing lights fading in the tinted glass reflection as the city swallowed the scene behind them. Inside, the silence returned, the same quiet Amara had carried since the ordeal began. Marcus glanced at her, his voice low but certain. They'll remember this. Not just today, but for a long time. Amara's gaze stayed fixed on the skyline ahead, her tone even as the faintest trace of a smile touched her lips. Good, she said softly. Because that was the point all along. The city lights grew brighter as the SUV disappeared into the streets, leaving the chaos and the story behind.